I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. So here we are amid another holiday season, and as longtime listeners know, we celebrate ghost stories for Christmas here every year. And they also know that another of my obsessions is the subgenre of folk horror films. Now, folk horror and ghost stories look at conflicts between the ancient and the modern worlds, and the fine line between the natural and the supernatural, if there's a line at all. Now, how thin is the line between ghost stories and folk horror stories? They both intersect in The Haunted Season, a new annual Christmas ghost story streaming right now on Shudder through the month of December. This can be your ghost story for Christmas this year. A new short-form horror tale will premiere every December, just like the old BBC specials did in the 70s. This year's movie is To Fire, You Come at Last. And it's not only a Christmas ghost story, but it's also included in the new folk horror box set from Severin. And my guests today are the co-conspirators who brought these two worlds together, Kier-La Janisse and Sean Hogan. Now, Kier-La is a film writer, producer, acquisitions executive for Severin Films, and the creator of The Haunted Season. She's the author of the highly influential book, House of Psychotic Women, and her new book is Cockfight, A Fable of Failure. Now, Kier-La also wrote, directed, and produced the award-winning documentary Woodlands, Darkened Days, Bewitched, which was a history of folk horror. Now, from the success of that came the acclaimed Blu-ray box sets, All the Haunts Be Ours. It's a compendium of folk horror. We're on volume 2 right now. I think that might be the last one. There's a million movies in both of those. Now, that was recently released, and in that it contains To Fire, You Come at Last. That brings us to Sean Hogan. He's the writer, director of To Fire, You Come at Last. His feature credits include the critically acclaimed The Devil's Business and The Borderlands. He also directed a short folk horror film, We Always Find Ourselves in the Sea, which is also included in the All the Haunts Be Ours Volume 2. And he's currently in production on a new feature film project, Scenes from a Young Girl's Disappearance. You guys have obviously been very busy. That took a bit to say. Kier-La and Sean, thank you so much for being on the show.
No problem. Nice to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So I guess first question I have, I love to find out about obsessions and passions, right? I mean, that's why a lot of us do what we do. And there's usually something that's like the starter of it all. I like to call it the first kiss with horror. Sean, I'm really interested to find out, what was the first horror movie that you saw that struck you so deeply that you became a fan for life?
I don't know if it's strictly speaking a horror movie, but certainly the gateway movie for me that I remember was probably King Kong, the original. I have vivid memories of being obsessed with that as a kid. And from there, it just seemed really natural. I was just one of those kids that seemed to have a genetic predisposition towards horror. Which has always appalled my mum, who doesn't understand where I get it from. But I don't know what it was like in the States, but in Britain in the 70s, it just seemed like horror was in the air. Everywhere you looked, there was horror, whether it was in comics or books or on TV or films, and in those days, there were a lot of older horror movies shown on TV still. So I remember sitting and watching the Lon Chaney Phantom of the Opera on TV one afternoon. But my dad would also let me sit up and watch the late night double bills, which were generally sort of Hammer movies and that kind of thing. So I just got a taste for it very early on. And then I'm the right age that we, got a VCR when they first came on the market. So all of a sudden I was watching wildly inappropriate videos as well, because my parents were kind of fairly laissez-faire about that kind of thing. I was allowed to watch most things with the odd exception. So, yeah, it was just kind of in my blood, I guess, and has been ever since.
That's kind of like in my upbringing, I could watch a lot of violent things, but no sex. So it was just one of those things where it was like that was the cutoff.
Yeah.
A bit of gore was okay, but I just remember my dad turning off The Evil Dead. I rented The Evil Dead, and my dad was like, "Oh, well, I'll set up and watch that with you." And we got about 25 minutes in, and he was like, "This is appalling," and turned it off. And I also remember renting the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and my mum being like, "Don't tell your dad." So I got away with that one.
Yeah, that's one you can't really get away with, right? And what do you have? Oh, well, just the title. You're doomed.
Yeah.
We had the same kind of thing in the 70s. We had the horror hosts who were kind of our gateway people. You know, the weatherman would put on a cape and then he would show these movies that came from the 50s that were sold very cheaply from the Universal vaults to all the independent television stations. And I think that really was a gateway for a lot of us. And Kier-La, I don't know if you want to talk about your first kiss, but gateway is probably pretty interesting as well, because you have this incredible encyclopedic knowledge. You have so many movies that you've seen. Now, back when I was a kid, there weren't any big resources that were out there. So what was your first corruptor?
I mean, it was, as I talk about in my book, my first horror movie I remember seeing was Horror Express. And I was too young to even really absorb the story or, really anything about it. So it was just like a central image from that film that became like part of my regular nightmares. But it was always, it was storybooks that had monsters in them, so like there was a Hallmark book that was called Lamont the Lonely Monster. And this was a big one for me. And then Grover, the Sesame Street book, the monster at the end of this book. So I was always drawn towards storybooks that had something to do with monsters or ghosts, and so that naturally translated into film and television, like I loved Scooby-Doo. I loved all the Scooby-Doo ripoffs that were like this sort, like the groups of teenagers solving mysteries and stuff. I loved the Hardy Boys mysteries, so it was kind of like, we didn't have the plethora of basically horror kids TV that they had in the UK. I mean, they had like outright horror shows for kids, so we tended to have things where at the end it would be revealed it wasn't really a monster, it wasn't really a ghost or whatever, but you would still get the trappings of a horror story, like kind of all through the episode or whatever. So I sort of grew up with that. And then my dad used to take me to flea markets all the time. So my stepdad, who was a big fan of older horror films. So he really liked Hammer films. I guess they weren't even that old at that point because it's the 70s now, but he liked AIP films. He liked Hammer films, and they would play on TV and he would be like, oh, come watch the movie. And so I would watch these movies with my dad, and then also like Bowery Boys types. He loved the Bowery Boys and East Side Kids and stuff. And they used to play on Sundays, like every Sunday morning, you'd get all kinds of Bowery Boys and Bowery Boys derivative shows. Or I guess the Bowery Boys themselves were the derivative show of like the East Side Kids and the Dead End Kids and stuff. But so you'd get these movies where, they'd be in a haunted house or they'd be, be meeting Frankenstein or whatever. And so there was a lot of this stuff that I associated with my stepdad and with like just fun times with my stepdad, and part of what we would do all the time were, because me and my stepdad lived in this little bubble almost, in our family. And we would go to every weekend, we'd go to garage sales, flea markets, things like this. And I remember buying my first like Famous Monsters magazine at a flea market. And same with my first Fangoria. So I didn't get the first Fangoria when it came out. I think it was like the first time I saw Fangoria, I think it was the one that had The Shining on the cover, which was like issue number 7 or something.
Yes.
Or possibly right around the same time, because I got them, like I would get them used, so I wasn't getting them like in sequence or as they came out. So I remember also getting the one with Dragon Slayer on the cover very early. So it was one of those, was like my first Fangoria. And my first Famous Monsters, I think, had like Jaws on the cover. It was like Jaws versus ape, like APE.
Yep. The old middle finger ape. Yes.
And so that was like the first Famous Monsters I got. And so, but there wasn't anywhere you could buy them just regularly or whatever, like it wasn't until I was a teenager that I found stores where you could just go and the new Fangoria would be there, so it would just kind of be like, as I would find these old monster magazines or books, like vampire books or whatever. And my dad he would either buy me the stuff or I would save my allowance and buy it with my allowance, But so my parents never discouraged it. As you guys both said, sex was a no-go, so my mom would make me cover my eyes if something played that had kissing or sex or anything, even like just normal affection between people. but like, but horror and gore and all that stuff was fine. My dad was less interested in gore, and my mom could deal with it, but her kind of favorite stuff was more melodrama type of horror,
Mm-hmm.
So like she loved the ABC movie of the week type of horror,
Right.
things like that. And she read a lot of the mainstream books, so she read all the Stephen King books, which I would then get from her, and then all the VC Andrews books and whatever, like whatever. But she would read this kind of stuff and then pass it down to me. So it was kind of coming from all these different places.
Yeah. So, Sean, it's been brought up a couple times now about the 70s and the BBC, or at least the UK. And as an American, I have to say that if they put any of the stuff that was on, Children of the Stones, Owl Service, even the Ghost Stories for Christmas, PBS would have been closed up by now because there was such an overt kind of paganistic feel to it. So there's always been this interesting embrace that the UK has for its past that America doesn't necessarily have. Were you steeped in folklore in the culture as a kid, or was it something that you came to later?
I think I more came to it later. I mean, as you say, it's kind of something that's in the air here, so you don't tend to think about it that much. It's so when we had the whole folk horror explosion, for certainly like, for British horror fans of a certain age, you kind of look at it and go, huh, yeah, I guess all that stuff is connected. You never really thought about it. It was just something you accepted because we're so used to that kind of vein of horror. But yeah, it was certainly not something I thought about growing up all that much. And I didn't see, I was kind of alive when a lot of that stuff was being broadcast, but I didn't see a lot of it at the time. The whole kind of this sort of rich vein of UK supernatural TV that was, very prevalent throughout the 70s was something I mostly came to later, because I was just obsessed with horror movies. I didn't really get that there was all this great stuff being done on TV as well. So
Mhm.
that was really something I had to go and ferret out later on. And because for years I guess you take for granted what you know. So when I was younger, I was completely obsessed with the US kind of new wave of horror of the 1970s. That was kind of like what I aspired to. And I was like, British horror's so old hat. It's like, all that stuff's really boring. And it took me a while to kind of find my way back to it and discover what was really interesting about it and catch up with stuff that I wasn't previously aware of.
Mhm.
And, the stuff made for TV is a big part of that, because it's always been, now more than ever, but it's always been difficult to make films in this country. There was a time, it doesn't happen anymore, the BBC and whatever are not interested in making supernatural TV now, but there was a time when this stuff was just considered drama like anything else, and
Mhm.
so they made quite a lot of it, and a lot of it is like really interesting, really cutting edge stuff, and is as important to the genre in this country as something like Hammer.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when later in my 20s and 30s, I started to hear about Christmas ghost stories. I'm going, Britain had ghost stories for Christmas? That's the coolest thing ever. And you're probably like going, again, great. It's probably like mom and dad watch that. I don't want to watch that. Now, I always love to find out about connections because obviously you both have very storied careers. How did you connect? Was this the Miskatonic Institute? I know that you had done a few lectures there, Sean.
No, it
No,
was
it was
before that.
yeah, it was back when I used to program for Fantastic Fest. Like the first time I programmed twice for them, but the first time I was like one of the founding programmers there, and Sean had come over with his film Lie Still. But we still didn't really know each other very well. And it was because I had to go to the UK and I needed to stay with somebody because I was making a documentary about Reckless Eric. And then I somehow got in touch with you and was like, hey, I know you don't know me that well, but can I stay at your house while I come over and film my movie? And then Sean ended up like rescuing me because I got totally screwed and left with no money. And Sean had to basically take care of me for the whole week.
Oh my goodness.
So yeah,
So,
that was kind of how it started. And then you used to come over and stay with me fairly regularly in
Yeah.
London at that point. You would often be over every like year or two.
Yeah.
And I think it was during one of those times when you said to me, "Oh, because we would sit and watch movies and stuff as you'd expect. And
Yeah.
there was one time Kayla said to me, "Show me something I haven't seen before," and I was like, "What the hell haven't you seen before?"
But it was
And I was
specifically like, show me something I haven't seen before that for you is in the UK, everybody's seen, something that like everybody here would just take for granted that you've seen it, but that I haven't seen,
And that was before the BBC ghost stories were widely available. They hadn't been re-released at that point, but I had some bootlegs from them like taped off air. So I was like, "Oh yeah, I could show you some of those." And I can't remember which ones we actually watched.
The very first thing you showed me was actually the Stone tape.
Ah.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So you were like, "Have you ever seen the Stone tape?" And I was like, "What's that?" And it's so funny
I think that by that point that was out.
It's so funny to think about now, because now I feel like all those movies are now just baked into me. Like I now have been dealing with projects related to these movies for so long that you forget that there was like a time before you ever heard of this thing, and it was only like 2012 or something. So it was like, whatever, 14 years ago, I had never heard of any of this stuff, and it was Sean being at his house. We watched the Stone tape and I was like, oh my God, more. And so then he showed me some of the ghost stories for Christmas and like Shulkin the Painter. And I think the show An Exorcism I saw.
Oh yeah, which I love. Yeah,
just all this stuff. It all came to me through Sean.
So the Stone tapes, you bring that up as something that I was going to get to about folk horror, that a lot of times we think about it as looking back, but there's kind of this digital age there's a bit of science fiction. I thought of Doctor Who's Christmas specials. Do you think that there's some films, once again, the definition of folk horror we can try and get into, but it's like wrestling with smoke. But the idea of the futuristic stuff being folk horror as well. I was thinking of, did you ever see the movie The Paper Man? It was a made-for-TV movie. And it was a bunch of
Stockwell?
Yeah, with the college students, and they have this. So that was kind of this thing where I felt when I was watching it, even though I'd never heard the term folk horror, that when folk horror got brought up to me later, I thought of that, because there was this idea of like there being a ghost in the machine, and it doesn't just live in the technology. It tries to build a corporeal part of itself. It's like punch cards and everything turn into this thing. So do you feel that there's something in modern films like, say, John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness? Do you see that as folk horror as well, or is that in its own?
I mean, Prince of Darkness is kind of a good example, because I was going to say Nigel Neal was kind of the main guy who was doing this mixing of folk horror and science fiction, and Nigel Neal wrote I don't know the whole history, but he wrote like the early draft of Prince of Darkness. So,
no, I think it was Halloween 3 he worked on, and then Carpenter like sort of nodded to him that Prince of Darkness was very sort of Neil influenced, because his pseudonym was Martin Quatermass. So he sort of acknowledged the debt. But yeah, I mean, like, Prince of Darkness is very Nigel Neal. Nigel Neal is the guy who I think is like largely responsible for that mixture of sort of folklore and science. That was one of his pet obsessions. You see it in the Stone tape, obviously, but you also see it in Quatermass, certainly Quatermass in the Pit. And I think that was something he kind of got from Lovecraft a bit, but because Lovecraft was working with his own invented mythology, whereas Nigel Neal sort of looked back at English history and melded that with science. And I think that influence is still there to this day. Really, he's been incredibly influential for someone who was largely forgotten or not even acknowledged for a while. It's been kind of heartening to see him get restored to his proper place in the pantheon.
Yeah, I actually even have a whole set of Nigel Neal stamps that were made by the Isle of Man.
Well, you got those. I didn't get those. You got those.
I got those, and the funny thing is now every year I get a Christmas card from the Isle of Man post office.
I love how the obsession of collection just takes over. I never even heard of these. And both of you are like, oh, you lucky devil. How did you end up getting those? So let's talk a little bit about the box set, but more importantly, the Christmas Ghost story, because that's running as of right now. And Sean, to fire you come at last. The first word that came to mind when I watched it was stark. There's just this black and white, high contrast darkness, and I love how it starts open and then it becomes a coffin, right? By the end, when they're on this road, it's completely black and they're just stuck in this claustrophobic world. It kind of reminded me of the ghost stories of Christmas, like the earliest ones, and the Body Snatcher. I think the Ransley character most certainly felt like the Body Snatcher. What were you It's obvious that you were trying to do Christmas ghost stories, but I guess the thing that I wanted to talk about is what was important to you about the Christmas ghost stories and what did you try to veer away from? Because, of course, as you mentioned before, you didn't really watch them when you were a kid, so they're kind of considered chestnuts.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what's important about them to me is I think they're sort of beautiful miniatures of genre filmmaking craft, for one. I think Lawrence Gordon Clark, who directed the
Mhm.
original run, most of the original run, um, if he'd made an equivalent series of films for the cinema, he would be acclaimed as a great UK genre director. And he's still not really. And yet, I think the sort of the way those films are put together, the sort of grasp he has of mood and landscape, all on very minimal budgets, I think is astounding. And they're just sort of great examples of how to create atmosphere and tension with minimal resources. You know, they didn't have huge budgets. There's a lot of suggestion in them. And so for me as a filmmaker, that kind of thing's always been quite inspirational, partly because I never have any money either. So I'm always trying to make a little go a long way. And they just sort of, I'm a big fan of sort of like mood and just that kind of understated dread which you find in them. That's always been something I've been interested in. So when I sort of discovered them and finally saw them, they just sort of tied in exactly with the kind of thing I was interested in. So yes, there's always been an attempt to sort of work in that mode, as it were. I mean, you mentioned Val Lewton, the Val Lewton film, The Body Snatcher.
Yes.
And again, Lewton is someone similar. He's someone I kind of constantly go back to because those films do something similar. They make a little go a long way. They're very literate and they're very understated. And that's just sort of something I really like. So, yeah, so that was always something I was striving towards. I suppose the only thing that I wanted to sort of shy away from, and I don't think this is necessarily true, certainly of the original run, but in this country now, because they've sort of the Christmas ghost story tradition has been brought back somewhat, even though
Mhm.
I think it's still a struggle to get one made every year. But it has been sort of resurrected, and we do get one most years now. But there's a certain coziness to them now, which I think is really the only reason the BBC still agreed to make them, because
Mhm.
they're now seen as like costume dramas, a bit slightly kind of some comfort food for Christmas Eve or whatever, and that's what I'm not interested in.
Yeah.
That's I wanted to fire to be stark. I wanted it to be bleak. I wanted it to be, it's not a feel good movie. Um, and I don't think the original ones are cozy. However much there may be a certain kind of cloud of nostalgia surrounding them now. I think if you go back and look at them, they're not cozy at all.
Oh, no.
They're actually quite grim, a lot of
Yeah.
them, and that was kind of something I wanted to get at.
Yeah, I agree. Looking at the BFI Blu-ray set where they have Whistle and I'll Come to You, they have both versions. And the difference between the two of them is just this ridiculous. And I think something that Val Lewton did, something that you were working with on yours and the original, say, Whistle, is that sound matters so much. And there's a starkness to the sound as well. So what really hit me rewatching the original is that it's really experimental in some ways. You have a guy who's mumbling for most of it, right? There's not a drive, a narrative drive that's really pushing it forward, except for these little things. And I think, I don't know if you based one of the shots on something from Whistle, but there's this moment in Whistle where he just grabs the whistle, and he goes finders keepers, and he's walking on the beach, and the foot comes right down in the middle of the soil. So he's like walking on the sacred ground, just being that guy, that Philistine. And there's a scene that's very much like that in yours, where they're carrying the coffin, and it's the start of the corpse road, and this foot just comes down in the center, and I'm like going, aha, that feels like it's an homage, but I'm not sure.
Well spotted. Yeah, that is absolutely lifted from Whistle. Yeah.
The sound design on there is great. And what really hits me is how, with the small amount of money that those had, and the difference between, say, the newer ones that are being done, is that they relied on like no soundtrack. In other words, there's no musical score. So there's nothing that is hinting what's going to come. So as small the thing as it is, I think it was like a weather balloon or something, the creature in the background on the beach, whatever that was, it still freaks me out when I watch it the first second that it's there, because it hits on something that's very nightmarish, and the sound cut is on a screen, right? It's not a full screen. It has this little chop. So anyway, I felt that in what you were doing, that in a way you were limiting yourself in a way to not only hit the budget, but get a feel for that old time when nobody's really watching I think most of the great innovation happens when nobody realizes that there's money involved and they're not watching. And so it's like suddenly they're like, hey, wait a second, these are making some money. And in fact, the original Whistle wasn't a ghost story for Christmas, right?
No. It was made for I believe it was made for a documentary strand. Which is weirdly what the original ghost stories were also under the purview of the documentary department originally. So Lawrence Gordon Clark was able to sort of kind of get away with having no one looking over his shoulder for a little while. So again, it kind of goes back to they just had a little bit of money and they went away and sort of made these weird little things and no one really cared. And then it just turned out that they were successful. But that's exactly. I mean, that's the way I like to work. I'm quite happy to be given, just enough money and then to sort of go away and not have anyone over interfering too much, and just come up with something weird like that. Whistle was the only one I think that I went back and looked at specifically again before we made this, because the other, they're all in my head anyway, and I tend to watch some of them every year at Christmas. The Whistle was the one I went back and looked at specifically for that kind of starkness of that black and white, and just that really just gritty quality that it has, the sort of 16 mil black and white. We didn't shoot 16 mil, but I tried to get a bit of that same grittiness in there. I didn't want it looking too clean. There's something about those films, they have a slightly handmade quality to them, and I wanted to keep that.
And I think it's great that you folks are working together, and this is the idea that, you get a certain amount of money and it's like, go with God. In other words, Kayla, it seems like you're executive producing this kind of thing where you just come up with an idea, you find someone that you trust, then you tell them, find a crew, get it here by this deadline. And I can't help but feel that that's a little bit of the world that you came. I know that you've been with Severin for a little bit, but I think that you've had this amazing career before that. So we can't help but look at it like the Beatles and Elvis finally meet, you and David Gregory. It's just like this perfect mixture. And Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, I saw it at the Chattanooga Film Festival and it completely blew me away. I was like sitting there going, all my notes were the first 30 minutes, and everything else was things I never heard of, never had a clue were even there. So it was like this wonderful bounty. Now, that was supposed to be like a 30-minute short, right? And it's become a 3 hour and 15-minute film. How much are getting David Gregory to agree to it, but how much leeway does he give to be able to let you?
I mean, for that, I had total leeway because he was so busy with other things that even when I tried to get help from him, he was too busy to help me, and I would just have to figure stuff out on my own, and I'd be like, I've never made a movie before, I don't know what I'm doing. And so I just had to make choices, and just basically, surround myself with other people like the editors and stuff, like who knew what they were doing. And if you look at my first assembly, because I did the first assembly myself, because at first I was thinking I was going to edit it myself. And it really is edited like a book. It's just information, but there's no sense of drama or pacing, or it's just like info. And then bringing in the professional editors, Winnie and Ben, it was like night and day. I mean, basically it was like they kept everything I had there, and they kept everything in the same place where I had it, and yet somehow still totally transformed it so that it actually felt like dramatic, and it had these moments, and it did not have that when I was trying to edit it myself, but David Gregory basically, because originally it started as an extra, and when I proposed it to him, it was not even for myself to make, because at that time I was still just an editor at Severin. So I didn't propose ideas. I didn't have any creative input in anything. I would just get assignments and I would edit some interview or something. And I said, so we were doing Blood on Satan's Claw, and I was like, somebody should make a little folk horror thing. And he was just like, okay, go ahead, go do it. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, go do it. And he was like, just, he's like, all the people you should talk to. I'm sure people who can film things. He just was like, okay, go do it. And after, so I filmed a few interviews, and then I had this, like, even just with the first 6 interviews, I had like a 2-hour thing, and I didn't know what to cut, and so then he encouraged me to do more. He's like, wow, you have so much interesting stuff. Why don't you just go further instead of cutting it, and just try to make something that, like, if you were making a documentary about folk horror, who else would be in it, and then just try to get those people. And so, so it basically was like, if I go to David and I say, I want to make a 3.5-hour feature film, and I want you to give me this much money to make it, he'll say no, but because it was like these little pieces, where he would see progress, and he'd be like, oh, I like that. If I give a little bit more, then you could get more. And then I would show him how far I got. And then he'd be like, oh, if I give you a little bit more, maybe you could do this, And so he basically like kept increasing the budget in like little increments. And he's still kind of like that. You still can't go to him and just be like, I want to make a film and this is how much money I want. It's like he'll agree to it as long as it goes with the kind of cash flow of each month, And luckily, because it's a Blu-ray business primarily, he does have revenue coming in every month. There's regular cash flow. So it's not like a lot of other film production companies where you make a film and then you just hope some funders come through, or it's like you have to have all this money at once, and you don't have this other like side business that's generating money, so in that sense it works really well that he can kind of fund these movies in this little piecemeal kind of way, so that as the bills come in, they can just be paid, but he didn't care about the length. He did, because he's like, ultimately it's going to be on a Blu-ray, so it doesn't matter how long it is. So there was he gave me like no constraints whatsoever, and a lot of times when I work with people, whether it's somebody like Sean making this film or making his previous film, we always find ourselves in the sea, or even like artists that I work on layout for books or, whatever. The main thing is I don't want to micromanage people. I don't want to have to micromanage people. I also don't think I have the talent to micromanage people. So I'm much more interested in finding people to work with who I already know they can do what I want. So I do tend to hire people who are good at specific things. Like I know there's a lot of filmmakers and designers that can just kind of do anything, and I don't tend to hire those people. I tend to hire people who are good at really specific things, because then I already know they can do the exact thing that I want, and then I can just say, okay, go do your thing. Because that's how I think it, and I think most creative people work best that way. I think most creative people work best when they're not trying to fit into all these little boxes, but they can just kind of trust their own instincts and go,
Well, I think that,
similarly, we should point out that To Fire was originally meant to be a conventional short film. When Kier-La first approached me about doing it, she was just kind of like, I want you to make a short for the next Haunts box set. And it was, intended to be a conventional 15-20 minute short.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what I initially started developing. I wrote a whole other script, which was a more conventional short film. And I finished that script and I was like, it's quite what she's going to want. And I had this other idea like bubbling in the back of my head. Kier-La had mentioned in the brief she'd sent me, she'd mentioned that she wanted to do something about ritual, and she'd mentioned corpse roads as an example. And I'd already done a lot of research on corpse roads because I actually have now published a novel about corpse roads. And I was like, yeah, I know about that stuff. And so this other idea just kind of came into being. So I ended up writing both scripts and sending them both to her. I was like, look, one's a short film, the other is longer, but I have a feeling that might be the one you like more. And then Kier-La was like, yeah, I want to make one. And I was like, all right, well, then we need to talk about money because I can't make that on a budget for a 15-minute film.
Yeah.
But again, I think you went to David and you got it all sorted out, and we had
because that's the thing. Like if when he sees the progress and stuff, he'll up the amounts, which is why I always, it's like I know that he won't let something fail. Like he won't. He's he's cautious about coming in at the outset, but usually once he sees things going, he'll be like, "Oh, that's good." Let's put some more into it. So
I think the passion is what really, I'd be surprised if he would stop anything, because you can almost feel the locomotive engine speed that you have of momentum with the ideas that you come up with. I mean, you're kind of a Renaissance person. You've worked in every medium, fanzines, magazines, film festivals, documentaries. It's a huge body of work. And when I first heard about Woodlands Dark, I had no idea whether you liked folk horror or not, but as soon as I heard it, I was like, oh, and this is going to be fucking awesome, only because I knew how deep of a dive you do. So for us obsessives that don't get out much, that kind of thing really is exciting to hear about. And it seems like that idea of hands off, not being a micromanager, really works as well in how you tell the story. Because I think one of the most brilliant things about Woodlands is that you never try to define what folk horror is. Instead, you have a bunch of experts who basically contradict each other. The first half hour is like these people are just like saying all this stuff, which makes it feel like it's wrestling with smoke. Now, with that said, you still have to curate 2 box sets full of these movies. So what is it that makes you go this one over this one?
Well, I mean, I used the movie really as a guiding force. It was sort of like whatever people talked about in the interviews, because there were some people who thought folk horror is this and other people who thought folk horror is that. And so the films that I chose for the box set tended to kind of bounce between these 2 poles, and those 2 poles generally defined would be, people who felt that the source of the horror in the films was something folkloric, like a folkloric creature or a folkloric witch or monster in the woods or something. And you would have these folk rituals to like ward off these things. And then the other branch of folk horror, which is that the people who have those rituals and believe in these things, that they are the source of the horror, that their weird beliefs are the source of the horror. And so those were kind of the 2 strands, and the Anglo-centric, and they don't fit totally neatly geographically, but very roughly it was like the Anglo-centric type of folk horror tended to focus a bit more on the horror where the people who believed the weird things were the source of the horror. And then once you get into Eastern Europe and Asia and stuff like that, the horror tended to be some kind of creature or monster, and the folkloric beliefs were actually the things that saved you from that thing. So the folkloric beliefs were a good thing,
Yeah. That brings me to some of the things that were really impressive in the second box set. Of course, the idea of the international films that are brought up. And when I first watched Woodlands, one of the biggest images that had my mouth watering was a mask, a wooden mask being put on a fire. And I was like, oh, I can't wait to see this in the box set. And it wasn't there. And I was going, how do I find this thing? So finally getting to Edge of the Knife was amazing. And, we have this movie that's in the Haida language. There's maybe 24 people that still speak it. So it's not just a horror, a folk horror film or folklore, it's also like this piece that is a touchstone of preservation. So you have something that what I loved about that and like Mike DeLeon's Rites of May is that you're immediately brought into a world mindset that you can be fascinated with. What's the difference between folk horror and folklore in some of these pieces? Because with something like Edge of the Knife, what I thought was really interesting is that the monster is almost just like a mental issue, right? Everybody comes together instead of like trying to kill the guy. I mean, they hurt him, but they're trying to fix him.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting, something that's not usually in our monster movies.
Yeah. Well, it's like he's overtaken by a spirit, so it's like they're trying to drive the spirit out of him and heal him. Which is basically because of his grief, because of and his guilt, and I mean, in terms of folk horror and folklore, I mean, like folklore tends to involve, it's broad, because folklore can involve, folklore about Bigfoot,
Yeah, right.
but it can also be like if you tie a chicken to your foot, you'll cure the measles.
Right.
Or whatever.
Well, that's funny because in America, we may not immediately understand folk horror versus folklore, but if I'm to say something like Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, in there, people go, oh, yeah, well, Rip Van Winkle's not a horror story. That's more folklore. And the Sleepy Hollow, well, that feels much more like folk horror. But you mentioned something that gets me to another of the movies that I thought was amazing, The Legend of Hillbilly John, which is, having to defy the devil. The main reason for that for me is it resonated because I'm from the coal mines of Pennsylvania. So all of that stuff, the idea of the long lost friend, the book, and the idea of powwow medicine is really interesting to me. And it gets me thinking once again about Mike DeLeon's Rites of May, where you have the Christianity side of things, but it almost feels like it's taped onto what's actually there underneath. And
because the Christianity in that, one of the things when I was choosing it for the box set, because the religion being depicted is Christianity, and I'm like, well, Christianity is the dominant religion, so can this really be considered like a folk religion? And then I talked to some of the scholars, and they were saying like, no, when you get into the rural areas of the Philippines, their version of Christianity is, we would consider it like a folk religion.
I felt that in Ireland, southern part of Ireland, where you go to some of the old cemeteries and you're like, well, there's the Catholics, the new school Catholics, very prim and perfect. And then you see these stones all over a small mound and it says something like, he's in the wind now. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a whole different kind of feel to the idea of death. I guess, Sean, I don't want to turn you into the Corpse Road guy. But at the same point, there's something about haunted places, sacred places, things that have to do with death that take on a certain level of gravitas. And that seems to be what this story is about. There's this gravitas that's what has happened to this man, and he becomes a ghost and haunts everybody. But it's also on this corpse road, which brings up so much superstition. And in Ireland, there's the fairy mounds. And when I was in Iceland, the elf villages. What do you think is like the modern equivalent to that kind of thing? Because to me, it's like folk horror started becoming big, at least from what I saw, when we started having the fiscal crises in Ireland and across the world. And all of a sudden you had logging going on in Ireland. And the next thing you know, you have The Hollow, that Colin Hardy movie, where they're logging. And of course, they get the zombie disease. So it's like we're once again starting to look at these places that perhaps it's from a sin, an industrial issue, whatever it is. Do you think there's something that's an equivalent right now?
That's a question I'd need to go away and give some thought to. I don't know, but I do think there's something in it. It's weird how folk horror exploded for something that had been there all along, and all it took seemingly was someone to stick a label on it, and then all of a sudden everyone became completely obsessed with it. And I keep thinking that it might go away somewhat, but so far it's still here. And I think there probably is something that it is tapping into a sort of kind of contemporary anxiety about what's being lost or the state of the natural world or all these kind of things that folk horror sometimes taps into. And it does seem to have really kind of ridden that wave. I think it's strange how something that's so fixated and concerned with the past and is often set in the past, and a lot of these things were made quite a long time ago, are speaking to us now. That's one of the really sort of interesting things about this whole phenomenon. But as to what the equivalent of some of these things are now, I'm not entirely sure. I just think that what's interesting about it, for me anyway, is the ability to make something that's about the past, that's set in the past, that speaks to the now. I mean, that was sort of one of the things I was trying to do with To Fire, was, aside from kind of like the period trappings and the spookiness and all that kind of thing, but one of the elements of it that was really important to me was the sort of class politics of it,
right?
Which never go away. And that's a film that's set hundreds of years in the past, and yet I think there's elements in it that we can still recognize now. The same way that you look at something like Witchfinder General, and again has a sort of political consciousness to it that's just as applicable now as it was then, and it was a film very much of its time, the kind of revolutionary radical late 60s. But I think again it speaks to the times we're living through at the moment.
Yeah, that's great, because that's something that I wanted to speak about. We aren't nearly as class motivated in the United States. Yet I was able to completely follow that there was something, even with the dialect, like everybody had a different language. They're all in Britain, but at the same point, they have different, languages almost. And in fact, at one point, the upperclassman is saying, I don't even understand the lower class, what they're even talking about. I guess for us, we look at it like middle management, CEO, guy who's unemployed, and the guy who's working. And I kind of felt that was the connection. Was there anything that you think that we might have missed because we're not so class motivated?
No, I think it does. I think people get it. I mean, one of the most interesting things for me was this film actually premiered in South Korea. That was like its first public screening took place in South Korea, which was just, they wanted to show the film. It was read just at the time we were finishing the film. So it just kind of happened that way. And I went over for the screening, and Kayla was there as well. And I just kind of thought, my God, how is this going to play to, I'm used to showing stuff to foreign audiences, but that's a very, very different culture. And I just, and the language and everything in it, I just thought, I don't know how this is going to play for a Korean audience.
Well, also, who knows what the subtitles were saying?
Yes, yeah, no, I know, because there's words in there that are very archaic, like period words, and I don't know how they translated them. But what I found was that the audience really seemed to respond to that kind of material, that they were, I think, from what I understand anyway, Korean society is still very hierarchical. And so the audience there were quite young, and they responded to that aspect of it, because it's still, however different the class system may be there to the way it is here, they still recognized it. They still recognized that's how the world often works, and responded to it. So no, I think that's, I know the UK is sort of a more class consciousness is more baked into our history, but I think it's hopefully universal enough that people can recognize what it's really about.
Well, and I think also right now, like literally now in the US, I don't think you can say people don't understand class differences. I mean, like it's I mean, some of the stuff about the folk horror and the villagers with their weird beliefs and stuff like that. I mean, like all these anxieties feel very real right now, dealing with like politics in the US, where you have people like so divided, and so fervent in their beliefs, like they're like looking at the other people like, that person's crazy. How could they possibly believe that? And the other side is thinking the exact same thing about them. I feel like a lot of the stuff that we see in that type of folk horror, definitely people are connecting with it right now.
I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I never thought of Donald Trump when I was writing The Squire, because I certainly did.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's I feel like I'm in PTSD right now. I grew up in a religious cult that said the world was going to end in 1975, and the same kind of philosophy and the same kind of argument is what I grew up with the idea of the persecution complex and stuff like that. So it's really crazy. It does feel like the last reel of Kill List has come true, and I'm just kind of stumbling through, these little tunnels trying to get out of here. So superstitions, folklore, all of that, it's kind of regional as well, as you had mentioned. And for me, when I was growing up, because we did the strip mining, because parts of the city collapsed underneath the coal mines, all this terrible stuff. The devil used to pop out of the ground. That was our big thing. It'd come out of the tunnels, or you would have the sound of dying miners, ghosts of miners coming out of places at midnight. What was the folklore around your place when you were growing up? Was there anything that you had that was the equivalent of that?
I'm not sure I remember anything. I was not. I mean, I sort of grew up somewhat in the countryside, but not in heavily rural areas. So I don't remember anything particularly like that. There probably, if you lived in the right areas, then I dare say there would have been stories like that. But I don't think, certainly that I remember, that I ever came across anything like that as a kid. I don't know if Kayla did.
So for me, it was like, I don't remember folklore so much as I do remember a lot of worries about child snatchers. There was like a rash of killings in Detroit in the late 70s where a bunch of little kids were murdered. At some point, like the son of the founder of GM was like the main suspect or something. I'm trying to remember because there was like it was kind of like not right in the core of Detroit, but it was kind of like in the rich suburbs. It was like these little kids were being kidnapped and killed and then like left in the snow. And right around the same time, there was like a little girl that went missing, not that far from my house. And so all these stories were kind of going around, and it was really, the beginning of what we would see in the early 80s with the milk cartons, and all of a sudden, if you're a kid, all the freedom of the 70s was gone, and you had to your parents started paying more attention to where you were, because for a while there in the 70s, you could just run wild like a feral child. But that was kind of the thing I remember, like always, like I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow as a child because I was so certain someone was going to break into the house and kidnap me, because these were the kinds of stories that were always going around. So that was the only thing I really remember, is like these mythical child snatchers.
It's a slight tangent, but it's somehow, I think, somehow connected. There's a public safety film, quite famous now, a British public safety film from the 70s called Apaches, which some people have sort of tried to kind of link to folk horror, because it's basically about a bunch of kids that die in farming accidents, and it's very disturbing. And I suppose if you could make a case for it as folk horror if you wished.
Yeah.
I had vivid memories of being shown that film at school, because I lived in an area where there were farms and things like that. They took us all into like the assembly hall, sat us down, and showed us Apaches on 16mm, and I was traumatized by it. For years I had no idea what it was. It was just this weird film that I'd been shown at school, and then obviously it kind of got rediscovered, and I was like, oh my god, that must be the thing. And I watched it again, and I was like, yes, it is, that's what I was shown, and it's still as disturbing now as it ever was. So in a weird sort of kind of tangential semi-folk horror way, that was a very formative experience.
And that film was made by the guy who made The Long Good Friday, right?
Oh, no kidding. Really? That's hilarious. We had a mystery one of our own, which was bus etiquette, how to get bused in school, and there'd be an accident, and they would show the accident in slow motion, and kids with blood.
And then it happened.
And then it happened. Yes. Absolutely insane. The thing I remember is a kid like smuggles a lock blade knife in. He's like, and everybody's going, look at the knife blade. So in the accident, he's holding it like this, and people are getting cut as they're flying by. And I'm like going, my God, this is madness.
And it's like the one where it's like one of the little kids has like a mouse and shows it to the bus driver, and then she faints while she's driving the bus.
And they end up in the water, right? Yeah, there's like this rolling and stuff, and then it ends up in a lake, or then it goes off of a cliff. Yeah, it's astonishing the way that we used to scare people. I loved how you mentioned myth of, because we had all sorts of things about child abductions in Pennsylvania, and it's like murder ballads, because there's like this story that's true, but then it travels everywhere. And I guess I know we're pretty much out of time, and I want to thank you for the time that you've given me. I guess I want to end with, we talked about ghost stories for Christmas. Is there a favorite ghost story for Christmas that you both have?
In terms of the BBC ghost stories for Christmas?
Sure, it can be BBC ghost stories for Christmas, yes.
I mean, my favorite of the actual run of original Christmas ghost stories is probably The Signalman. I just think that's the kind of peak of the series, just in terms of how well that story comes together, the performances, everything. You know, it's just a little gem of a film. But I also have a great fondness for The Exorcism, which is it is literally a Christmas ghost story. I think it was broadcast in November. It wasn't broadcast at Christmas, but it is a ghost story that takes place over Christmas dinner, and it's the most feel bad Christmas story possible. It is so bleak. It is so depressing. Just the idea of anyone sitting down and watching that at Christmas just amuses me no end. But I think it's like it's a beautiful piece of work, and there are probably strands of it into Fire, but that's my kind of other pick for a really feel bad Christmas ghost story.
And that one was part of Dead of Night?
Dead of Night, yeah.
Okay, so there was another show called Dead of Night, and it was like an episode of that. But I mean, of the official ones, I was gonna say also probably The Signalman. Although
so the Dickensian one, the Dickens one.
Yeah, it's the Dickens one in terms of like the most effective, like for what the remit of the series is. You know, I agree that's kind of, although, you know, there are like shots in the first one, The Stalls of Barchester, that I think are amazing. Because supposedly it was all shot by candlelight, or mostly shot by candlelight, is what the director said. But I am also controversially, I mean, not so controversially now, but for people at the time, I'm a big fan of Stigma, which is the first of the modern ones, because the last 2 episodes of the original series turned to modern original stories. Like, they were not adapting stories from the past. And so from what I understand, people were like, you know, this isn't like, they ruined it. But the first of those is called Stigma, which is about a woman and her family that move out to this place in the country near a bunch of standing stones, and they're trying to remove a standing stone from their yard, and they unleash this like spirit that gets into the woman, and basically she spends the whole movie hemorrhaging, like just bleeding, and she's trying to make dinner and do her, you know, but she's like in the bathroom, like constantly bleeding, even though she has no like wound. There's no visible wound, but she's just bleeding, and she's trying to hide. At first, she's trying to like just hide that she's bleeding, and then eventually it's like she can't hide it, and she's like in bed dying, you know, and I love that one, I think. And I've said before in interviews, you know, I love that one, I think, because like, I think like women can really relate to the idea of being in a bathroom bleeding and trying to make it seem like you're not bleeding, you know, like I was like this, I feel like all the women really love this episode of the Ghost Stories for Christmas. So so that's a really great one too.
Yeah, God bless YouTube. Weirdly enough, when I first found out about Ghost Stories for Christmas, outside of what the originals were, I just tried to find it anywhere, and I got to see that one, and I was kind of jaw-dropping. I really like Stalls of Barchester as well, and I really, for the new ones, and it might be controversial, the Tractate Midoff, I just absolutely...
I like the Tractate Midoff. I think it's one of the best new ones, definitely.
Yeah, it's because kind of casting the runes in a way.
Yeah.
And I love that kind of story. And it just felt very, very cool. So anyway, thank you so much, everybody. I want to thank my guests, Kier-La Janisse and Sean Hogan, for their time. It's been great. You can catch the inaugural episode of the Haunted Season on Shudder for the entire month of December. There's still time. Get out there and see it. Volume 1 and Volume 2 of all the Haunts BRs are available at the Severin Films website, as well as other Kier-La Janisse offerings. There's the Central World of Black Emmanuel box set. There's a House of Psychotic Women box set. Some fantastic movies in that. So there are specific movies from her book. And coming up, Killing for Culture, correct?
Yeah. So Severin has licensed or optioned the book Killing for Culture by David Korekis and David Slater, which was a hugely important book for me as a teenager, or I can't remember if I was a teenager in my early 20s when it came out, but dealing with Mondo films, snuff film, death captured on film, this whole phenomena of this industry of this type of filmmaking, basically. And so it's going to be a much more grim film than Woodlands, Dark and Days, Bewitched, but I won't make people sit through 3.5 hours of it. That's all I can say at this point. Is my aim is for it to be a lot shorter than my previous film, just because the subject matter I think will be too hard for people to, and then also having to be a bit more experimental with what I'm doing with the footage, because I also just don't want to have people watching death footage for 90 minutes, and just being like, ugh, this is soul destroying. So it's been interesting, because I'm trying to think of unique ways to make that film that can make people really think about and talk about what those films imply, the impact of those films culturally and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I have both volumes, the newest edition. And if there's anything telling about where we are in the country and the world right now, is that the original book takes from the silence all the way up to 1993 or whatever, when it was first done. And the second half, which is 93 to now, or whenever it was, it's double the size, more than double the size. And you're just going, man, if that's not telling right there, I don't know what is. Yeah. But of course, this is a holiday we're talking about.
Yeah.
Once again, thank you both for being on, and thank you for listening, everybody that is out there, and happy haunted holidays. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and my Twitter handle is Hellbent Horror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.